Thank you all for being here in the Moogle tent this afternoon. I know it's the pointy end of the festival. I think we're the last session in this tent and the second last of what has been an incredible 5 days. If this event was being held in Australia, what is customary at the beginning of any public event is to issue an acknowledgement of country. In Australia, that would go something like, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we meet, and then you would name those lands, and acknowledge that their sovereignty was never ceded and those lands were stolen, and then pay respects to elders past and present. As that is not as relevant in this situation, I just would like to acknowledge the people of Rajasthan who have welcomed us here onto their land, who have been so generous in every respect. I'd like to thank William and Sanjoy and Namita for putting on such a beautiful festival, and I would particularly like to thank all of the volunteers who have just worked tirelessly for the last 5 days to make us all so welcome and to make our trip so incredibly memorable. So I have the great pleasure of interviewing Peter today. Peter's book is an absolute joy. He's one of those historians whose work is grounded in deep archival research and scholarly rigour, but who writes like a dream and takes us along on his journey with him in this case, across the seas. And it's going to be a great pleasure to talk to you about this beautiful book, Peter, Endeavour, the Ship and the Attitude That Changed the World. Now, The Guardian called this book an engrossing love letter to a word, an attitude and a ship. And I'd like to structure our discussion today, Peter, around those three kind of separate themes, the ship, the word and the attitude. So let's go to the ship first, okay? We spoke the other day in the biography section, a session that was on, about writing the biography of a thing rather than a person. And really what you've done here is to give us this beautiful cradle-to-grave biography of a ship. So I wonder whether you can situate us here and introduce people to this ship by giving us some of those sort of vital statistics or those rites of passage, the kind of birth, death and marriage, if you even can, of the Endeavour, the ship.
Okay, thank you, Claire, for the generous welcome. I'd like to echo everything you said about the kind welcome we've had, the wonderful hospitality that we've enjoyed over the last few days. I suppose if we were at Glastonbury Festival, it's another place we could imagine, they always have the legend slot right at the end on the last day. So we'll go with that.
All right, we'll take it.
We'll take that.
We'll take it.
So Endeavour. Okay, let me give you the vital statistics, if you like. This is the name of a ship which was afloat between 1764 and 1778, a relatively short life of 14 years. I claim, and I will stand by this, that I think it's the most significant ship in the history of British exploration. We can talk more about that in a moment. The ship had three distinct identities, three different names. It was first known as the Earl of Pembroke. Secondly, it was known as Endeavour. Later, it was known as Lord Sandwich. It started off being a ship in the coal trade, taking coal from the north of England to the growing city of London. It was then bought in 1768. It was converted into an exploration vessel. It was given a new name, Endeavour. After the circumnavigation of the world, that we'll talk about in more detail, it was sold out of the Navy, bought as private property, given a new name, the Lord Sandwich, and it went off to America carrying troops. And the thing that I was always really interested in, and this goes back to my childhood really, my mother comes from Scarborough on the North Yorkshire coast, and we spent all of our childhood holidays there. So we'd go up to Whitby, which is a little fishing port with a very interesting history. And there was this kind of great industrial heritage of the colliers that used to carry the coal down on the sea road to London. That interested me. And when we were taken to the Captain Cook Museum, there would always be this story about Endeavour being a coal collier that was converted. And this idea of mutability, of an object changing from one thing into something that's fundamentally different, was really attractive to me on a storytelling level. And I started to think of it as like a David Bowie of ships, if you see what I mean. It was going through these...
The ship that fell to earth.
The ship that fell to... Yeah, exactly. Well, we could try with that. But it was like three different theatres of history. You had the world of trade, the world of exploration, the world of war. These are all fundamentally different things. And it went from being a machine for making money to a machine for making knowledge, for it to become a ship for carrying troops. So I think contrast and texture are really important in storytelling. And it was around the same time that the British Museum were doing their History of the World in 100 Objects that I started to think of, well, what if you turn that on its head and you have one object but with 100 worlds hidden inside it? And this is really the story that I tried to write in the book, and it never disappointed me. There was always something new. People looked at it in so many different ways. And actually, let's see. Would you like to see a picture of it? Because I think I do have some pictures. Let's see.
There you go. It's going to work.
Is it working?
Oh, going fast.
Oh.
Oh, you can see it in front of you. You've been going through it. There you go.
Okay. This is my commercial announcement. There's the cover of the book. So I'm going to whiz through these very quickly, but I thought they'd be a really nice visual reference point for you because ships are all different sizes and shapes. Here you can see one of Turner's famous nocturnes. This is of Shields on the River Tyne. It shows a very typical picture of the colliers being loaded with coal in the north of England. Sorry. So many directions to look in. The next one has to be here because recently I've been on William Dalrymple's Empire podcast talking about this. The main catalyst for which is a Dalrymple in this story, and you'll see the Dalrymple if you want to look for any family features. You'll see in the bottom left of this Alexander Dalrymple, who I'll talk to you a bit about in a moment. There's loads of historians here, and we all know that there's a Dalrymple in every generation. Usually up to something. So you can see the bottom of James Cook there and some sails, but that's Alexander Dalrymple. Here is a figure called Joseph Banks, some of you might have heard about. He joins the Endeavour voyage during the circumnavigation and really is a proto-Charles Darwin, David Attenborough kind of figure. We can talk about all of these. I know I'm whizzing through, but I'm trying to give you some reference points. And here itself is the ship. At the most dramatic moment of its life, when it was stuck on the Great Barrier Reef. The first interaction between anything from Europe and the Great Barrier Reef, I believe, is right before you. The ship very nearly sank when they sailed straight into it, and for 24 hours they struggled to free the ship from the reef. If it had sunk, the history of the world may well have been very different, something to think about. And of course, I don't want to gloss over the fact that this is a very, very controversial object. It's a controversial period of history. The period of history I'm talking about is analogous to the period of Clive in India, the rise of the East India Company, the subjugation of all of that. Here is a fascinating picture, I think, which is drawn by an artist called Reg Mombassa. And he is showing the object from the point of view of an Aboriginal Australian, not as a ship as we saw it before, but as a huge, rapacious, terrifying eye coming towards you. So here are all of the complexities of the story in a very short time. And last of all, I'd say that this is a story which is still being made today. So in 2019, I went to the North Island of New Zealand to talk about the 250th commemoration of the voyage, the arrival in New Zealand. And here you can see a waka, which is a typical Maori craft with the Endeavour in the background. One of the most incredible academic experiences I've ever been involved in. And I would recommend highly to all of you academics here to start every conference with a haka. It gets you going, that's for sure. Okay, so that's back to you now.
Well, Peter, thank you for giving us those illustrations. The visuals are a terrific way into the storytelling, and you've also basically given us a reference point for all of the points that I was going to touch on. We didn't even organise that between ourselves beforehand, so good job. I just want to stick with the ship for a moment. And in particular, you focus on the wood that was used, the oak. I'm interested in this, you taking a materials technology point of view. And when we talked, Samsung has been mentioned many times in this festival for obvious reasons, and that's where we think technology is now. But wood was the technology of the time. Can you tell us a little bit about the wood and maybe some of the relics of the wood from the Endeavour that have come down to present day?
Sure. Well, if you go, so I wanted to start with the acorn, which is the obvious place to start a biography of a ship. So I spent a lot of 2015, 16, that kind of time, when everyone was arguing about Brexit, looking for the location of an acorn in the north of England. My friends thought I was mad, but it was great fun. And ships are essentially about 90% oak. They have a bit of elm in them as well, but then the rest of it is grass. So it's a very natural object. It's all kind of woven together and to make something which is utterly unique. And I think that's in this age of Samsung mobiles, which are obviously very good, but we think of we think of things being standardized, things being one the same to the next, mass production. What I wanted to do was evoke the spirit of the ship by finding out what the peculiarities of the ship were. And it turns out this was another 6 months of my life, you're getting here, that I delved into the different character which is created by different construction materials. So oak in the north of England had a different character to oak in the south. Okay, different species of oak, but it grew in a different way. And people had their regional prejudices. The Royal Navy would not get oak from Yorkshire because it was kind of thin, nasty stuff. They used to like oak from the south of England. But these Whitby colliers would sometimes sail for 100 years in the northern oceans. And out of a British Royal Naval vessel, you'd get 30 years as an example. Now, you might think this is trivial, but when you're stuck on the Great Barrier Reef, and there's some bit of coral going through your bottom, it kind of matters how strong the ship is. So this is the kind of stuff that I was getting into. I'd like to think nowadays, where there's been a recent discovery in Newport, Rhode Island, Narragansett Bay, where they know that Endeavour is there now. And I like to think that my endeavours in trying to find the acorn might have some use as they try and identify the timbers of the ship themselves.
And is it true that a piece of the Endeavour went to the moon on the 1971 Apollo 15 voyage?
It's both true and false, because they thought a piece of oak went to the moon on the Apollo voyage, but they actually took the wrong piece of oak. Which in itself, because there was a very interesting afterlife to the story. So what they actually took is most likely to have been part of Cook's second exploration vessel, which was called the Resolution. But I'll tell you, I mean, we're jumping around a lot here at the moment, but at the moment in Narragansett Bay, which is part of the state of Rhode Island in the States, there's been a huge marine archaeological project going on for a long time, which is financed by the Aussies and run by a local archaeological team. And there's lots of wrecks down there, and they've been going through the business of trying to find which one is the Endeavour. So they went down from 12 to 5 to 3. Now they've narrowed it down to 1, but 1 isn't the same as a positive identification, so you've still got to find out if that 1 has some kind of thing that you can pin it to Endeavour. But that's a story that's ongoing.
Okay, so they took the wrong bit, but they wanted to take a bit of the Endeavour to the moon. So what was that about? Why? Why did they want to take a piece of this ship to the moon? What did it symbolise for them?
Yeah, well, I think it's always been seen... Okay, let me back up a generation. Let's pretend we're in Jaipur in 1976, if we can imagine that. The way the voyage was seen, maybe that in that generation, was like this is a paragon of human enterprise, endurance, inquiry, high point of the Enlightenment under sail, etc. So you can see how that would be carried over into this new phase of space exploration. And actually, the Endeavour voyage, which was 1768, kind of 2 centuries before the Apollo missions, more or less, people drew the obvious parallels, going to new places, so on. I think this idea of the word endeavour was something that I was very interested in as well. And this is why, if you look at the subtitle, you'll find that it's the ship and the attitude that changed the world. Changed being an ambivalent word purposefully here. But there was a particular attitude in Britain in the mid-18th century that I wanted to write about because I thought it was interesting. And it was the same attitude that produced all sorts of huge projects. And it wasn't just a voyage of circumnavigation, it was things like Johnson's dictionary or the great encyclopedias which were about to come out. Or these huge projects that in any other age would have seemed hubristic. But for a while there was like support for them. Oh yeah, you can do it. It's kind of give it a whirl attitude. If you go back earlier into the 18th century, there was something called the Age of Projects, which we talk about in historiography as well. But the Age of Projects, I thought, was slightly different to the Age of Endeavours, because people used to laugh at the projectors. They'd say these crazy people with great ideas, but they were like lost with their minds in the clouds. During the Endeavouring Age, people were really swinging behind these projects. They were funding them. And I think that the missions, the SS Endeavour was really trying to capture something of the aesthetic a few centuries on.
So there we are. We're now at the word endeavour. So we've come to that second part of the ship's life, past its role in trade, now to its role in exploration. So that voyage to Australia and New Zealand from 1768 to 1771 that you've mentioned, extraordinary project that was funded and was given the go-ahead. Can you tell us a little bit about the political economy behind that voyage of discovery, what it was, what they were setting out to do? Yeah. How would you characterise that particular voyage?
Should we talk about Dalrymple for a moment? Here's the moment.
Well, he comes into this, so you can wind him into the story.
So this connects with a different history. So a man called Alexander Dalrymple came back. He was an employee of the East India Company. And during his time in India, he'd managed to get his hands on the charts of the East. Now, this was an age, as you all well know, when Britain was looking outwards. It was looking for profit, okay? Alexander Dalrymple returns from India in about, I'd say, 1764. Don't hold me to that, but about then. And he has the charts, and he has a theory. And his theory is this, that at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, which was then known as the South Seas, lay a huge, undiscovered, unexploited landmass, which had not been discovered by Europeans. Now, there was a theoretical framework to this, which was known as the counterpoise theory. So, according to this theory, which doesn't begin with Dalrymple, it starts earlier than this, but an equal landmass had to exist in the northern and southern hemispheres. Otherwise, the globe would spin off its axis. Okay, and Dalrymple came back to London. He spent a long time trying to get people interested in his theory because he wanted to go. He wanted to be the Columbus of the Georgian age. He wanted to stand on the prow of the ship, go first ashore, establish relationships, and create a new trading relationship with an undiscovered land. I mean, what idea can be more exciting to a Dalrymple than that? Okay. This then connects with something else which was happening far away in the solar world, okay? There was a rare astronomical phenomena called the transit of Venus, which was happening in the 1760s. And while it might seem quite trivial and quaint to us today, it was of huge importance to philosophers and natural philosophers in the 1760s, because if enough information could be gathered about the passage of the transit from different points of the Earth's surface, dispersed points, then all of these calculations could be brought back to the mathematicians in London, who could then work out what was called the solar parallax, which is the precise dimensions of the size of the solar system. Now, let me promise you, there's nothing more exciting to an Enlightenment mind than that. This is the kind of stuff they've got really off on. So, one of the places where they needed to send someone to take these observations was the middle of the South Seas. There'd been several voyages which had crossed the Pacific Ocean by this point, but they wanted to go right to the middle. And there was a really interesting discovery of a place which the British called George's Island, after the king. Of course, it wasn't called George's Island at all, but that's what the British called it. And they set off, the idea was to set off there in 1768. Dalrymple wanted to be the captain of this voyage. Everything was going perfectly until the Royal Navy said, "Mr. Dalrymple, you are nothing to do with the Navy at all. You're going to have to step aside." And at this point, a different character enters. Every Australian will be fed up of his name, but I'll say it for you now, Captain Cook. He wasn't Captain Cook by this point, he was just Lieutenant Cook, James Cook, and he was put as the commanding officer on the Endeavour. They sailed on this kind of remarkable voyage, which all went wonderfully to plan. Any of you who've read David Grann's book, The Wager, recently, which has been very popular, will know how badly these voyages can go if they're not done very well. Well, Cook was, I described him once. I was interviewed about him by the Sydney Morning Herald, and I described him as the Donald Bradman of sailors, which I think is the kind of thing that will, make sense here in India. He was just very good. He was very competent. He was not flashy. He was a superb surveyor. He was a superb seaman. And he took them round Cape Horn, took them to Tahiti, which is this island, George's Island, I was telling you about. The transit observations were made, and then the second part of the voyage began, which was to go searching for this mysterious southern continent.
So we'll get back to Captain Cook and why every Australian is fed up to the back teeth of his name in a minute. But one of the things that I found really interesting in your book was your inclusion of somebody who wouldn't necessarily normally appear in a book about 18th century Enlightenment ideas and exploration. Of course, we've got Banks and we've got Samuel Johnson, as you've said, and Cook. But you also talk about Catherine Macaulay. Can you tell us some more about Catherine Macaulay and also why you chose to include her in this book?
Well, Catherine Macaulay is someone who I feel like quite partisan about. I'm glad you brought her up. I subsequently wrote a book which came out last year called Life, Liberty and the Pursuit of Happiness, in which I told her story more fully. But Macaulay is someone who's part of this endeavouring culture. Like there was, I think there was this sense of potential that I was explaining to you before, endeavouring, etc., which extended to this crazy idea of giving woman power and agency. So Catherine Macaulay back in Britain in the 1760s became the first female professional historian. She was a bestseller. She had a voice. She commented on current affairs. And her story is really intertwined with that of a man called John Wilkes, who, again, I wrote about subsequently. Macaulay fits in to the story of Endeavour because at about the time the voyage was about to embark, in 1768, Britain was in a state of social collapse. Politics had become extraordinarily polarised. There'd been massacres in London. There were mobs rolling through the streets in a way that make 2024 seem pretty sedate, to be honest. And Macaulay was there. She was having a say, and I wanted to include a female voice, and she was there. So she deserved her place.
For those of you who would like to know what happens in authors' green rooms when we're not on stage, I've been trying to convince Peter to write a full-length biography of Catherine Macaulay. I think he's the person to do it. Because if I do it, as a female historian, people will say that it's just feminist gerrymandering. But if Peter does it, people might actually sit up and take some notice of the fact that Catherine Macaulay was a great woman. And that's by the by. So, Peter, tell us a bit more about what happens then on this voyage. I'm particularly interested in Banks and the 30,000 specimens that he brings back. So you used the word before, they saw that there were these unknown, unexplored lands, and the word you used was ripe for exploitation. So tell us about something of the hunting and gathering nature of this exploration. Now, I use that term advisedly because obviously that's something that, a word that's generally applied anthropologically to indigenous populations. But these white explorers were hunters and gatherers themselves. Tell us about Banks and the specimens he brought back.
Banks was a disciple of someone called Carl Linnaeus. I mean, I said to you before that a very sexy thing to be in the 1760s was interest in mathematics. Actually, one notch above that was to be interested in plants and the plant world. And this was all fitted with a framework of knowledge that was emerging about classifying, so finding, classifying, and displaying. Okay? These are all core things within Enlightenment philosophy. Banks joined the voyage because he saw it as an absolutely unique opportunity to go to places that no one else has been before, to gather things that have never been seen before. His hope, I think, was to find something that was similar to the tulip. You know, this kind of came in the 17th century and lit up polite society in that time. So Banks keeps this journal of his time. It's his voyaging journal. And I'd say it's probably the paramount Enlightenment document. Anyone can read it today. It's got a very modern sensibility. His eyes are always looking outwards. So he's not like a creature of the 21st century who worries about his interior world and his neurosis. He's just out there all the time, scampering around like a Labrador on coasts and beaches. Okay? But this, of course, does cause problems. It's a problematic impulse as well. So when they get to Tahiti, they sail around various islands which are nearby after the transit. And you find Banks in moments of kind of crass vandalism, where he goes to Apua and Marae Tapataputia, I think it's called. And you see Banks sticking his hand into the god houses and pulling out the insides. And when I was writing this, I remember there's a bit in there where I say, can you imagine what it would be like if some indigenous person arrived in London, went to Canterbury Cathedral, opened up Thomas à Becket's tomb and stirred around the bones. It's this kind of idea of intrusion and vandalism. And that is present. And Banks, of course, doesn't see any problem with this because his impulse and his raison d'etre is to collect. I mean, so the document has to be read in those terms. But yeah, I mean, it was a voyage of collection. When Endeavour arrives back in Britain in 1771, the amount of specimens inside is absolutely extraordinary. His herbarium is bigger than Linnaeus's herbarium in Uppsala, this famous place in Sweden. And just this one ship has more plant specimens inside. So you have to go through the journal looking at these moments. So the voyage has been examined over the years by people who are interested in botany, who are interested in anthropology, who are interested in human contact. And there's a lot of material in it. Sometimes it's problematic. But I think overall, you know, the relations that were made between the two were generally positive, and there were some flashpoints, which we can talk about if you like.
So let's go there now. The thing about your book is that it's a book about a different time period that is written for our times, which are post-colonial times, decolonising times, in terms of knowledge and the gathering of it and the representation of it. So the Enlightenment project, as you outlined, was also a colonial project. And I'm interested in you telling us how you were able to write from the other side, from those whose bones were stirred up, from those who were exploited, who bits of their lands, their cultures were taken away, and ultimately those who were dispossessed. Like every school child in Australia learns that Captain Cook discovered Australia in 1770, that this is the start of history. And which, of course, now school children learn that there are 60,000 years of First Nations occupation prior to Cook. So we learn of it now as a contact moment. So tell us how you, as a 21st century historian, were able to capture the perspective and the voices of those who were on the wrong side of the Enlightenment project?
Yeah, I've got a friend who's an Australian historian, and she always says, well, the Enlightenment looks a bit different from where I'm standing. And I know exactly what she means. And the way I wanted to approach this book from the beginning, how I wanted to structure it, was a little bit... Do you remember that TV programme, Lost? Do you remember this? And like at the end of every episode, it would focus in on a different character. And I thought, well, if I do this with the ship, you can have a different character for each chapter. So for every chapter you have a different guide, and hopefully the different guide challenges your point of view. So of course you have the very familiar imperial points of view. You have Banks, who's a quintessential Enlightenment. You might have his artist Sidney Parkinson, who's a kind of Quaker, which is again a different sensibility again. But then you get these really interesting characters. So the voyage has been in great part reclaimed in New Zealand as Tupaya's voyage. Tupaya being a star navigator and an ROI, which is, again, a completely different way of coming into the story. So I said to you before, when they got to Tahiti, they had all these encounters. Tupaya was one of those who encountered the Endeavour's crew there. And actually what happens subsequent to this is that he joins the voyage, and he's not there as an observer. He has agency. He's controlling the ship. He's showing them the old sea paths under the stars of the Pacific that the Polynesians have known. So then you're connected to one of the... because the Polynesians are the greatest seafarers in human history, right? But how they colonized the Pacific was through great understanding of their local environments and understanding of the stars. So the British would not have managed to find places like New Zealand on their own. This is one of the places they went to. So you have Tupaya as a character, and my favourite chapter maybe in the book is the one on Australia, because there's so much rich academic work now coming out about oral history, encounters, as I showed you there. There was one song poem which had been recently translated into English, which had been passed down in oral memory for 200 years, which described the Endeavour going along the coast near Fraser Island or Kagari. These kind of moments gave such a texture to the book, and sometimes it could be really profound and really strange as well. There was a place in Whitianga on the North Island of New Zealand. There was an account which was made of Endeavour there, and they said this is how the Maori described the British as being like goblins. They thought they were goblins with eyes in the back of their head, and the reason for this is that when they descended from the boat, from the ship, and got into the boats and they pulled on shore, they rowed with their backs to the way that they were going, so they thought they must have eyes in the back of their head. These kind of little details I thought were wonderful in their own right, but again, you can over-glamorize, you can take these things too far. So often it's this... when I talk about the art of writing, I like to tell students to state, restate, counterstate. Always interrogate your sources. You don't have to come to a solution. You don't have to know, but you can give them pictures, okay, that they can follow. And in Australia, it's definitely that.
So in Australia in 2020 was the 250th anniversary of Cook's Landing, and that was a big commemorative moment for the nation. The then Conservative Morrison government earmarked well over $100 million for that commemoration, $50 million alone for the refurbishing of a statue of Cook in Morrison's electorate, which is called Cook. When there are over 110 statues of Cook there already. How did you...
Maybe 109 at the moment. Right?
Yes, that's right. Because on the 26th of January, which we celebrate as Australia Day, which is actually when Phillip came and planted the British flag 8 years after Cook. But there was a statue of Cook in Melbourne, my hometown, that was cut off at the ankles and the statue was dragged away. So it's actually just two ankles on top of a plinth at the moment. So yes, 109. To show you the sort of... give you an illustration of the sort of heat and passion that this issue generates. How do you, as an historian who's not coming from Australia, this is not part of your domestic politics, how do you see where the Endeavour sits now in global politics? And I'm particularly interested in the fact that you're here at this festival promoting this book and not your latest book. I mean, this book came out in 2016. Can you tell us a bit about the reception of it then and now? Why are we still talking about this, and how will we continue to talk about it? Sorry, I've said about 9,000 questions in that question.
Well, I'll pick the one that I like. I think the thing with the 2020 anniversary and the Morrison government in Australia, I always think they were probably quite relieved there was a COVID pandemic because they didn't have to do anything in the end. And so you've sometimes got to... This is where history is fascinating, okay? Because we're talking about these stories now in ways which I think is much more confrontational. We're interrogating the characters. Of course, you get a load of the politics of today being, kind of projected onto the incidents of the past, and sometimes you have to cut through that. But I think Cook in himself is someone who has been hugely overpraised in Australia for so long that I think he could take a bit of flack. I mean, it's not beyond him to do that. But in some ways, I go back to my visit to Newcastle, which is north of Sydney in New South Wales. I went there with an Aboriginal man called...
John Maynard?
Yeah, John Maynard. Thank you for rescuing me. And he sat there, and I talked to him about Cook at length, and he said, "I like Cook, mate. I really like him. Really like him." He was like the kind of the hero of the left in the sense that he'd worked himself up from the bottom. His story was one of social mobility. He was a farm labourer's son. He did well. He spent a smaller period of time in Australia. I think where the historiography of Cook is very interesting is that he was killed on Valentine's Day 1779 in Hawaii. And this chronology matches very closely to the loss of the British colonies in North America. So he was very much promoted as a colonial poster boy. And you know this more than anyone. There's and everywhere you turn in Australia, you have a Cook this, Cook that, Cook this. And he a lot of people say, well, I didn't mind the first Captain Cook. It's all the ones that came afterwards that I didn't like. So there's this element of the story which feels so, so connected with today's politics. The second part of your question is how the book came out in 2018. And I found, I have to say, a lot of reticence in Britain talking about empire and colonialism. People were they didn't have the language maybe, people were quite worried about finding themselves in a Twitter firestorm. And then post-George Floyd, I think the conversations have opened up a huge amount. And I've been here listening to all sorts of academic storytellers, writers over the last few days, talking about subjects which we can all debate, we can all have a point of view on, but we are talking about them at last, rather than British people having a kind of aversion to any knowledge or of their own past, which is quite noticeable for me. Okay.
We've got time for one last question from me, and then I'm going to throw it over to you guys. So please get your questions ready and throw your hands up. Peter, the last thing I want to ask you is the subtitle of the book. Subtitles often matter. The Ship and the Attitude That Changed the World. Changing the world, okay? Is that a marketing tactic? We see this in television documentaries. And what happened next would change the world forever. Mm. So if we're talking about technology, we're talking about the pill, the printing press, penicillin, a ship called the Endeavour. Tell us how it changed the world.
Well, let's go back to that moment on the 6th of June in 1770, when that ship was suspended on the reef for 24 hours. If the ship had sunk, no one would have known where it had gone. They would have just vanished. So many of these exploration voyages, if you like, are open-ended. We could look at the Franklin trips up to the North Pole in the next century and so on. What would Australia's foundational story have been? What would have been the story for New Zealand? what would have happened to all the specimens collections that Banks had brought. Cook would not have gone on to make 2 subsequent voyages. There were 3 voyages in total that he was part of. So I think in those senses, it's more than, I do think it was a moment, one of these moments in human history where things could change. Britain, you have to look at the chronology here as well. Britain lost its North American colonies at the same time it was finding somewhere in the south, okay? And we know what happened in 1788, and this is where you can pick up the story, I suppose. But that's why it matters, and that's why I wanted to look at it. And I suppose it goes back to a bit of oak. Yeah.
The year that changed the world. Okay, ready for questions from the audience. Fellow back there with the baseball cap got his hand up super quick.
Hello, Peter. Welcome to India. You should come more often. We love you here.
Thank you.
So my question is on Banks. He's like celebrated world over. He was someone who introduced plants like eucalyptus and acacia in the West, and more than 80, 90 varieties of plants are named after him. So, but in the voices of the global South, they are discussing now that, okay, wait a minute, he was someone like a flag bearer of colonialism, and, our children are like venerating him and, remembering his name because his scientific name is, a stamp on more than 80, 90 plants, So do you think there is like a need for change of narrative, not only in social sciences, but not in sciences as well? Because some of the hangover on colonialism in science is not talked about or even discussed,
Yeah, I think so. Are you talking about decolonizing names of?
Yes.
Decolonizing
yes.
the science.
And how do you see the narrative changing? Because
I think so. I think in many ways this is our age. This is a story of our age. Is that we're trying to find new points of reference. I should say actually in the Dalrymple's side, there's a lot of the names of Australia. You have places like Cooktown, or if you go to New Zealand, there's all the names of the crew have become names of the places. Or Point Hicks is another good example. So what happened then, this initial moment of encounter, has kind of stayed with us. And it's maybe when you look at these old names, do they really work in the same way? I suppose it's got to be taken on a case-by-case basis. I'm not sure. If you feel like, I don't know, Bombay, Mumbai, we're in this process at the moment. We change things because they don't suit. So Dalrymple's point at the beginning was very much about find the local name, keep the local name, preserve the local culture, because when you remove that, you remove knowledge. Can we get back to the original? There's a lot that's been lost, but it's the story of our times, I suppose. Yeah.
This fellow and then this fellow.
Hello. I wanted to ask you what do you think of expedition of Bougainville and about the first woman who went round the world with him.
Bougainville. Well, he was in Tahiti between the Dolphin and the Endeavour, I believe. A very interesting life, Mr. Bougainville. He was part of the same period of history. So you can, if you're interested in Pacific Islander history, there's a huge amount that you could take from that. Again, it suffers from exactly the same problems that the Cook voyages do, I suppose, in the sense that there was a lot of, sexual exploitation in Tahiti between the various crews, which is something which had a very long and lasting legacy. I don't know. I see them as almost being because there was a lot of with La Perouse as well.
I was going to say, the French are very much part of this story.
Well, I suppose this is the point, isn't it? That if Australia hadn't been Australia, it could have been something to do with France.
And it is one of those sliding door moments of what if history that's often
I could say a lot about this, but I'd be going on for a long time. But they belong to the same, part of history.
This fellow at the front here.
Thank you. One and a half question, if I can.
One and a half, okay.
Yes, because you mentioned about oak. When Britain started building ships in India, they replaced oak with the locally available teak, the Malabar teak, which apparently was found to be much better than oak, at least the Royal Navy oak. I don't know about the Yorkshire oak that you mentioned about. But have there been similar experiences in other countries where when Britain or any other country built ships, they used the local wood, and how did it relate to oak?
Well, here you go. You've asked me a question, right?
Can I just follow up? I may not get another chance. She'll point to another fellow then. So the second one is you talked about, you mentioned knowledge of the East. Dalrymple was in East India Company and he got the charts of the East. Can you elaborate a bit more? Because what was the foundational knowledge of these charts? Was it colonial charts? Was it made from knowledge of those who were there before? And if it was in India or parts here, it would have been the eastern route to the southern seas. The fact that Cook went through Cape Horn, did he use this chart at all, and in what way did it come to use?
You've got a minute and a half, Peter.
Okay, right. So oaks, we made ships out of fir at the beginning of the 19th century, and that kind of worked as well. Big history about oak and timber I could tell you about later. Cook, Dalrymple, charts. Okay, so they had to go the way they did to get to Tahiti, which was the primary objective of what they wanted to get. And you're right. So, in fact, you will all know the context that I'm going to talk about now. So it's to do with the battles between the British and the French, particularly in the conquest of Pondicherry, I believe, in the mid-18th century. And Dalrymple was one of those who got into the map room, and he discovered a lot of material from the French, and that came back to London via that means. So you can see there's a really interesting connection between local history and this Australian story. One wouldn't happen without the other. Dalrymple was really, really angry with Cook because he got through a little strait, which is to the north of Australia, and found his way back home, and he was really angry. He wrote lots of capital letters in the piece that he wrote. So Dalrymple's been written out of history, but I'm giving him a moment today. Is that quick enough?
That's great. Does anybody have a real quickie? Up the front, please. Is there a microphone for the woman up the front, please? Do you want to just shout it out? No, here comes your mic. Don't worry, the buzzer's going to go in 1 second, but go.
Just a quick question on what was the impact of the Age of Enlightenment and all the exploration on the wider British society, as in the middle and the lower classes?
What was the effect of the Age of Enlightenment on?
The impact. Like, did they participate? Did they benefit from it? Beyond the upper classes.
Let me finish with Samuel Johnson, who's the greatest of my heroes, I think. And Johnson's, I'll give you a quote of his to think about, but she said, "The natural flight of the human mind is not from pleasure to pleasure, but from hope to hope." Johnson said, all these schemes of going abroad and making money, what do they mean to the common person? How many people actually died on these voyages? How were people made happier by going abroad and setting up colonies and exploiting local populations? The answer was that British people, the average British people, were often divorced from the fruits of these voyages. And did they make the world a happier place? I don't know. You could talk about different types of progress. You can have economic progress, but you can always have moral progress, and that's an interesting thing to think about. Okay.
Well, thank you, everybody. It's been a very enlightening session. And Peter, I think you are the right historian for the right time. Thank you for what you've given us. I encourage you all to buy this book and read it. It's a beautiful work.